Hello again. Hello everybody, my name is Gary Merrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Cruz County Business Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Lunch and Learn this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see so many familiar faces and also faces that are not so familiar. So I'd like to welcome those of you who are both members of the Business Council and who are visiting us today. So we are a group of about 65 organizations in the private sector. We're made up of CEOs, business managers, general managers, and senior executives of companies that range from light manufacturing to one of the most important internet companies in Northern California, Cruz, to the restaurant and hospitality industry, to commercial and real estate development, to realty companies, to the banks like County Bank and the Santa Cruz County Credit Union, who is here, to the newspapers and media. So we cover just about every sector of enterprise within Santa Cruz County. Not to mention healthcare, communication, several others. And we employ something on the order, we've got to do a count because it changes a bit, of 20 to 25,000 employees of Santa Cruz County. And I like to think of us as we're part of the 99% that works really hard every day to employ the rest of the 99% who live in Santa Cruz County. And I think it's safe to say that the council members represent the private sector economic backbone of Santa Cruz County, but I think it's also safe to say that we represent the heart and soul of Santa Cruz County. You'll find us on nearly every nonprofit board and the sponsor list of just about every event that you'll see in Santa Cruz. We live here and we work here and we work to make here a better place. Our goal is to address the strategic issues facing our community through private and public partnership. And to that end, we work to assemble, organize, and coordinate the talents of resources of business and professional leadership. To work with the elected officials and folks who work hard in the public sector to make our community a good place to live. Notice that I say with members of the elected and public sector. In the past, shall we say, we've had sometimes a contentious relationship, but I think it's very important to point out that our goals are shared. That is, we have a common vision, which is a community in Santa Cruz that can thrive economically, producing a living wage and sustainable jobs, even in times like these, which are fairly challenging, I would say, for most of us here. And it's a community that cares for the quality of life for its citizens, the current ones and the ones that will follow us. And also a community that protects and preserves the beauty and natural resources for generations to come. One of our key objectives is to educate and inform public sector and our citizens about the value of business and why creating conditions that are favorable to good business are important to the greater good. We do that work through our committees, particularly the Transportation and Government Affairs and Economic Development Committees, through meeting with our elected officials and agency officials, through communication to the public via the newspaper articles, opinion articles, letters to the editors, our website, public speaking engagements, participation on local commissions and boards, our work with and on local chambers of commerce, and through our quarterly lunch and learns like this one. Sometimes they're breakfast and learns too, as we had back in May when we had a group of CEOs, several of which are here today. So if you'd like to learn more about the Business Council, please pick up a brochure, or as I said before, talk to a member of the Business Council who is here today. We've got a new and improved website, which is just launched. It's in the crawl, almost walking stage, so come back and visit it often because it'll be improving literally week by week. And I want to thank Kristen Jones-Heitzler over here, who has been working really hard to get our website up, and it is currently up and running at sccbusinesscouncil.com. Okay. And so before we move on to introducing Dr. Michael, I'd like to publicly recognize a couple of people who are here. And there's far too many to recognize, but there's one sitting right over here at the head table. His name is Mr. Ted Burke. And for the last year, Ted has been the chair of the Business Council and was co-chair before that. Ted will be stepping down in 2012, but will remain on the council, and I'm sure, because we're going to insist on it, that he remained very active on the Business Council. And have renewed, I think, under Ted's leadership, our passion and commitment as a Business Council. So thank you, Ted. Would you please rise and accept some appreciation here? And is Chris Mann here? I haven't seen Chris. Chris, raise your hand. Okay, I'd like to introduce Chris Mann, who is our new chair for 2012. Chris has been on the council for several years, and as a representative of Granite Rock, Chris is the director of real estate services for Granite and has been the co-chair this past year. Chris brings an equal measure of intelligence and fresh ideas, energy, and vision to the council, and I think he's going to be a worthy successor to Mr. Burke. And I can tell you from my personal relationship with Chris, he's a joy to work with. So, Chris, would you stand and receive our thanks? Well, it's my now very great pleasure to welcome back to Santa Cruz Dr. Jeffrey Michael. Jeff is the director of the Business Forecasting Center at the University of Pacific in Stockton, California, where he lives with Holly and his children. The center produces quarterly economic forecasts for California and 10 Northern California metro areas, in addition to creating special reports on current business and public policy issues impacting the regions. The Santa Cruz County Business Council has been a sponsor of the center's work now since about 2010, and as such, the center now includes the Santa Cruz County as one of the areas in its forecast. Jeff's areas of expertise include regional economic forecasting and environmental economics. Much of his research has been on the economic impacts of environmental policies, such as the Endangered Species Act, sea level rise, greenhouse gas controls, and land preservation. I like what he says on his blog site. Depending on the facts, these studies sometimes favor environmental viewpoints and sometimes business points of view. And I think the key there is depending on the facts. And so we're going to hear some facts, hopefully some good ones, about what the outlook looks like for Santa Cruz and for California. Jeff's research has received numerous grants, been published in scholarly journals such as the Journal of Law and Economics, Southern Economic Journal, Energy Policy, and Ecological Economics. Jeff makes frequent presentations to regional business and government audiences like this one. Has been cited over 200 times per year in local and national press, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and a bunch more. In October, he's one of the 3 economists on a panel at the 17th Annual Early Bird Economic Forecast in Sacramento, talking about the state outlook economically, and it's sponsored by the Business Journal. This year, he'll be cited once again in the prestigious Santa Cruz Sentinel and can be seen in a few weeks on local television. And thank you to Santa Cruz Community Television. In about a week or two, those of you who want to see this again or encourage people who were not able to attend the luncheon to see it, might be a good Thanksgiving break for some of us. It'll be televised on local TV in about a week. So it's SantaCruzCommunityTelevision.org. Is that right, Peter? And it'll be on the website. So you see the website, and we'll also post it on the Santa Cruz County Business Council website, so you'll know when it's going to be airing. Jeff has started a blog a couple years ago, Valley Economy, a discussion of economic, business, and environmental issues of importance in the Central Valley. And since he has so much time on his hand, I'm going to encourage him to do a blog on the Santa Cruz and Central Coast area as well, right, Jeff? Before coming to the University of Pacific in 2008, Jeff spent 9 years as faculty, associate dean, and director of the Center for Applied Business and Economic Research in Townsend University in Maryland. Jeff received his PhD from North Carolina State University and his master's from the University of Maine. Jeff was with us last year for the first time of what we will hope to be an annual update, and we hope an increasingly upbeat update of the California and Santa Cruz business outlook. So please join me in welcoming back Dr. Jeff Michaels.
Thanks, Gary, for that introduction. Didn't know we were going to be on TV today, but that's always nice. Make sure you put a date on that television broadcast, since the facts are always changing. But I reviewed the presentation I made to this group last year, and I was mostly right about things. So hopefully this one will have similar staying power. We'll repeat a few themes as we did last year. Basically, I'm going to start at a more macro level, talking very briefly about the U.S. economy. I'm going to cover an incredible amount of space here in a very short period of time. Very briefly talk a little bit about the California economy, get in my one political stump speech, since there's legislative staff here, on a couple of issues that I think are important on the agenda. And then discuss the Santa Cruz economy a little bit, some observations I have about it, and a few bits of our outlook going forward. So let's start off nationally, and before I show this next picture, I'm happy to see the bar is open. Some groups make the mistake of shutting down the bar when I start to speak, and I've known that I actually shift demand to the right for drinks as we move into the slides. So no offense if you feel like you need one, or a look out the window as we discuss the national economy. This is a view of University of Pacific. It's almost as pretty as the one out the window here. So my 10-second plug for University of Pacific. This is the fourth university I've worked for. By far the finest institution I've ever been associated with. It's really a wonderful place. I invite you to visit our beautiful campus in Stockton, or our San Francisco and Sacramento campuses as well. It's great to be part of an institution. I love it's entrepreneurial, it's private, it's on the way up. So send all your children. We love them all. All right. So the first picture is I've borrowed some of these pictures, particularly from the national economy, from various sources who make prettier graphs than I do. And this one is what I call the Great Recession in one picture. And this is basically just looking at job losses for every recession since the Second World War, and it graphs them in terms of the percentage decline in the path up. And you'll see that the current recession is the red line, the one that doesn't look like the other lines, and it doesn't look like the other lines in just about every negative possible way that you could have. First of all, the decline in employment is a little bit over 6%. The largest of any recession since World War II. And also the duration and the length of time to get back to pre-recession employment levels is exceptionally long. You can see the slope on the red line on the recovery is excruciatingly low. We're adding jobs back. You hear the monthly jobs reports that come back, 80,000 jobs, 100,000 jobs. But as a nation, we lost about 6.25% of our jobs, and we're still almost 5% below where we were before. So if we don't pick up the pace of job creation in this country, it's going to be another 6 years just to recover that December 2007 employment levels. I do expect that eventually we will pick up the pace, but it might be another 2 years before that pace picks up to a substantial level. And you'll see that previous recessions, the slope of the line on the way back up is typically much steeper, particularly recessions that are built around manufacturing downturns and some other cyclical sectors. So I can't help you get a job in this terrible job market, but I'm going to help you understand a little bit more why you can't find one, or your children can't find one right now. You can be enlightened. This picture, if you look at California, it's slightly more depressing. So this is basically the same picture of job declines, and California is the blue line. And basically you see a similar pattern, except instead of declining about 6%. We declined about 9% here in California. And the way back has been similarly slow and painful, particularly lately. It looked like we're picking up a little steam at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and it's flattened out a bit lately. So we've got a long road back when it comes to employment. That's why everybody's talking about jobs. So one way to think about how we're going to have an economic recovery, or perhaps understanding why it's less than we would like right now, is just to think about the components of the macroeconomy and how they're doing and what their prospects are, and think about where are we going to get the growth from that brings us back. And the first one to talk about, I'm going to show some pictures. I'm going to briefly run through the four major components of GDP, real boring here, and then show some pictures that illustrate some of these things. But the first one is the consumer. Is consumption going to lead us back in the recovery? Well, consumption was part of the problem to begin with, that consumption savings was declining, consumption was growing. But in the first 2 years of the recovery, consumption's been something of a stalwart performer. It's one thing that's really outperformed my expectations. But the issue is that one of the economic imbalances was that consumption had sort of gradually shifted up from 62, 64, then 66, and ultimately up to 70% of GDP as exports and investment and other things declined. And it's still at 70% of GDP. So we haven't really made progress towards this rebalancing of the economy to a little bit less consumption and more investment. Consumption growth is probably going to slow for some reasons I'll show in a moment. Another component of the recovery is investment. Well, investment has components, including residential investment. Residential investment is usually the first thing that leads us out of recoveries. Well, as everybody knows, that's not the case here. And that's a big part of the reason why that job line is so flat coming out of this recession, is that typically one of the things that really bounces back at the beginning and leads to that steeper recovery from a recession is doing nothing. It's contributing nothing. Even modest recovery in this area will do a lot to boost growth. Business investment is doing better, particularly in the equipment and software side. We're fortunate to be close to Silicon Valley and San Jose, which has really been coming back pretty strong. Commercial real estate is something that I'm not going to talk about, or you'll end up at the bar as well. Government is another component of GDP. Is government going to drive the economy? Well, government has certainly had a role in stopping the free fall and sort of getting the recession back on track. But right now, government is moving into a contractionary mode. There's a lot of pressures on it. It doesn't have the ability to lead the recession back. And that leaves exports. So exports are an important area. The very solid recovery is underway in exports. We'll show some pictures of that. And we expect exports over the next decade to be a significant contributor to our recovery. I believe that the trade deficit will decline as long as oil prices don't go to $200 a barrel, or the trade deficit will decline. But that is always a concern. So exports are a component of recovery. Investment is a component of recovery. Consumption can't lead the recovery, but it's an important part of it. And government has got some challenges. So let's look at some pictures. Here's the consumption side of things. There's a graph of retail sales. And this is one there where, there's not that many graphs where the current point of the line is higher than the pre-recession peak. And retail sales is one of them, and I wouldn't necessarily expect that. But what you can see is that we've been slowly growing consumption over the decades. This particular graph starts at 1992. And, retail sales and the consumer looks like a pretty steady thing. A little chop, but generally increasing. If you're a city manager out there, you look at charts like this and say, what's my sales tax revenue going to be next year? You look at the previous 20 years, you see a relatively steady pace, and then something happened in the fall of 2008 where it just falls off a cliff. Particularly on the taxable sales. I know the Business Council, likes to educate its local government officials, which is a very important role. They need educating, but I do have sympathy when it comes to sales tax and the way taxable sales fell off a 20% cliff nobody would have planned for, even the most conservative business person. And it's been a very difficult recovery since then. But however, the consumer has been pretty surprising. I think my forecast was that this would grow, but more on a parallel path to the old one, and we've actually seen the consumer rebounding a bit faster than we might expect. Some new data earlier this week showed another 0.6% month-to-month growth in retail sales, and so it's kind of impressive. No one shops like the Americans. The problem is we've been doing it by reducing our savings rate. So here's a picture of the savings rate going back to 1960, and you can see savings rates in the U.S. were running around the 8% range for a long time, and then slowly started declining in the 80s and particularly in the 90s. And as our consumption grew, our savings declined, and we financed more. We relied on overseas savings to finance investment and other things. So this is part of our problem of our economy slowly coming out of balance over time. As our economy restructures, we're going to see higher savings rates as households need to shed some debt and get healthier balance sheets themselves. And we certainly see the savings rate jump during the recession here, which is the blue lines. It jumps up to about 6%. But one of the concerns, as I told you about how the consumption has been impressive and more than you would think, is that some of it has been coming at the expense of savings. And the most recent reading on the savings rate as of September was down to 4%, which is the lowest savings rate in the U.S. since the financial crisis. So this is not the way we want to grow consumption. We don't want to grow it by sort of reverting back into some of our old habits. So this is a little bit of a concern, and I don't expect this to be a trend that continues. And one reason why I think the consumption growth is on a somewhat unsustainable growth path right now in the near future. But those of you in this audience are probably aware one thing that would help the savings rates is if those banks would start paying interest again. I know there's a few banks in here, and you remember interest? Certainly the reward to savings was a little bit greater during some of these times where we saw higher savings rates. And so, everything, it can't be just explained through sort of moralistic bad behavior terms. Obviously, incentives play a role. Debt. Nobody does debt like California. Whether it's the state of California or it's just mirroring its citizens, because this is per capita debt, household consumer debt by state. California is the red line, so you can see for the last decade, California clearly has outshone all the neighboring states, until interestingly, we did briefly get a run for our money from the great state of Las Vegas, which is the blue line, temporarily reaching our per capita debt levels at about $80,000, $90,000 per person. But as those Nevadans have been, walking away from their mortgages and moving back to Los Angeles, you see they quickly have been shedding household debt. And we're now back at our place at the top of the list at about $75,000 per capita. About 80% of that is mortgage-related debt, whether home equity loans or mortgages, and the high cost of housing and the large mortgages that people get into in California is part of the reason for this the main reason for this high per capita debt. And it's particularly noticeable when you realize we have lower than average home ownership rates, so fewer people actually have mortgages. But nationally, this again is part of the debt picture. You can see it's moving from a little bit under $25,000 per capita to about $50,000 per capita in household debt. So households need to deleverage. They need to shed their debt one way or another, and they're in that process, but it continues, and it's something that's going to hold back consumption. Let's move on to government. Mike Machado told me earlier today, I haven't followed the news this week. I've been enjoying the Central Coast. Wonderful meal at Shadowbrook Restaurant last night, a little kayaking yesterday. But Mike informed me today that the federal government crossed the $15 trillion, Mike? $15 trillion debt mark. So here's a picture that shows you how they got there, and so quickly. But this tells you something about the fiscal picture and the prospects of government to employ us all and solve this problem in the future. And you'll see that it gets quite interesting. If you go back to 1980, the blue line is federal government expenditures. The red line is federal government revenues. And you can see that we have run budget surpluses in the past. And you see the blue line, the expenditures, is the more steady line. But it does have some interesting sort of dips and flattening and steepening periods. And then the revenue line is a little bit more dramatic in its shifts. If we go back, if we want to take a lesson from the 90s, where we actually were successful in producing a budget surplus, that was a collection of good policy and good luck that led to that. But something I want to point out is everyone's familiar with the fact that we did raise income taxes under Clinton in the early 90s, and that's certainly, you can see the effect of that in turning the red line up a little bit. We also had a major stock market bubble and asset bubble that juiced up those expenditures around 2000 when we had the surplus. But the other side of that surplus is the blue line. It's a little bit harder to see, but you actually see that the expenditure side from the federal government, and this is not controlled for inflation or population growth or anything, actually flattened out quite a bit. And that's the other side of that surplus, that if that blue line had not flattened out and it continued growing on the same path that it had during the 1980s, we would have never achieved that surplus. It really, even in that time when we were facing a deficit of that magnitude in the early 90s and the magnitude of a few hundred billion, I have a hard time sometimes with these the size of these numbers at the national level. It took progress on both expenditures and revenues in order to balance the federal budget, but it actually happened faster than anybody could have thought. One of the problems is we move into, we got pretty excited about having that surplus, and you'll see the expenditure line tips up significantly steeper in 2001 and 2002. As we increase part of the decline in federal government spending during the 90s, a lot of it was declining military expenditures after the Cold War and base closings, but we also had welfare reform and major changes to farm policy and agriculture policy and other things which restrained spending. All those things came back in 2000. All the big farm subsidies came back. The military spending came back as we went off to fight terrorism. New entitlements in terms of health care programs, and you can really see the federal spending line take off. At the same time, we passed a tax cut and had a minor recession, and you can see the red line and the deficits begin. But that's nothing compared to where we are now with we've been running $1.2 trillion deficits for a few years now at the federal government level, and these are truly a problem, and these cannot continue at the levels they are. We're truly if you look here, we've got $2.4 billion in revenues and over $3.6 billion in expenditures. That's spending 50% more than is coming in to the Treasury in revenue. The contribution to that is both, you see the expenditure line, which started growing and has certainly has not decreased. It continued growing. You can see the impact, the recession certainly had an impact on the revenue side with the initial drop. And then you see the impact of the Stimulus Act, which is where you see the blue line takes a jump upwards and the red line takes a jump upwards. Because remember, the stimulus, $750 billion stimulus package was a combination of both tax and revenue measures and spending measures. And that really opened things up to the $1.2 trillion level where we remain today. So one of the benefits of looking at it from this perspective is just to say that I think anybody who's too much the problem is significant and it's real and we have to deal with it. But anybody who says that we can completely solve this problem, I think on the revenue or the expenditure side, is not being realistic about having a $1.2 trillion deficit. There's going to need to be some changes in both, and I expect we're going to see some declines in government spending. We're going to see some tax increases. We're going to see government policy become more contractionary as we go forward, both here and at the state and local level. Because the federal government has been doing a tremendous amount to hold up the state and local governments in the early parts of the recession. That support is evaporating, and we're seeing the impacts of that in our communities now. So that's government spending. Let's go on to, here's another cheery picture. We'll get to better stuff at the end. This is new home sales. So one reason to show this picture is to show that the light blue lines are recessionary periods, and this picture shows that as we leave, home sales and construction is a very cyclical industry. It generally turns down during recessions, and it's also one of the big contributors to growth coming out of them. Almost always we see construction, and measured in this case in new home sales, jump up in the early periods of recovery. This was true in 2001, where it never really declined and then jumped up to this sort of high unsustainable level of construction we're familiar with. You can see the decline, which shows you just how much residential investment was part of our downturn. But one of the problems with our recovery is you'll see we're 2 years into the recovery. Instead of coming back up on the tail end of the picture, you see that actually new home sales and residential investments taking another step backwards. And it's very difficult to get robust recovery when a highly cyclical sector that's traditionally part of your upturns is going nowhere. In fact, maybe even sliding backwards. So this is one of the reasons why we've had a slow recovery. More on the positive side, exports have got to be part of the recovery, and exports have been growing really well. Exports, this is a picture of the trade deficit where we can see imports and exports, and yes, the trade deficit is high. The imports are higher than the exports. You can see, though, that the imports have not reached their pre-recession peak yet. Anybody working at the ports in Long Beach and LA and Oakland can explain that to you. Although they've recovered quite a bit, they're not have not recovered to their pre-recession peak, whereas exports, on the other hand, have come back after a steep decline and are above their pre-recession level. So we have been growing exports somewhat faster than imports. That's been improving the trade deficit situation. It's been a very important part of our recovery, and it's going to, and it has to be, a more important part of our recovery going forward. Another thing to note from this thing is that even during these periods of our trade deficit growing and growing and growing, note that the general prevailing trend in exports is for growth. Some people do not believe me when I say exports are growing. They say exports aren't growing. I'll take you to Target. I'll show you. You know, nothing there is built in the United States. We don't make anything anymore. And so when you go to Target, you're only observing the blue line. You're not observing the red line. You've got to go, you have to be able to see the perspective of consumers overseas, and you understand that it isn't just more foreign products in our stores, but there are more American products being sold in other areas, and that what we have is a globalizing economy, and that exports really are growing, and they are an important part of our recovery. And particularly in California has been very successful in growing exports with the recession, and this is actually one of the bright spots, and I think something that will become brighter. Helped by a lot of things, including a weaker U.S. dollar. But this is one reason why people are concerned about what's going on in Europe in 2012. Europe's got an economy is about the size of the U.S. economy. It's a substantial, there's a lot of concerns about Europe related to the financial system, but also just related to a major European recession and its impact on the demand for U.S. exports could be significant. So the summary of the U.S. outlook for 2012, okay, it's similar to California, slow growth. And basically we're trying to make this transition from our base of recovery, which from consumers and government, to investment and exports. So now exports have done relatively well lately, but we need that to continue, while I think the consumers and governments are going to pull back a little bit. Residential investment is not yet ready for recovery. And I think we're looking at a 1.5% to 2% employment or GDP growth world for 2012 and 2013 in the U.S. and and that's very similar to our California outlook. That puts us pretty mainstream. Maybe the prevailing view is more 2.5, slightly more optimistic than us. Unemployment hovering around 9%. Talk briefly about California. Make some observations about Santa Cruz from afar that are mostly data-based. So similar to the U.S. outlook, our forecast that we just released last week sees real gross state product growing 1.5% in 2012, 2.2% in 2013, very similar to the U.S. growth rate. here in California. So this is a sort of the slow, unsatisfying growth. And I think that when we get to 2014 and 2015, we're finally going to start getting some positive contributions from the real estate investment sector. We won't have 2006 or 2003 again, but just getting off the floor and seeing some renewed growth and some activity again there will help get our growth back up into what we would consider a recovery phase. 2.5% to 3% growth is average growth. Anything less than that and an economic recovery is hardly a recovery, and why we have this high unemployment. So getting up into this 3.5% to 4% range, I think, is something that we'll see a little bit later in 2014 and 2015, barring any unforeseen events. So as we know, the world can change quickly. So that's the current prospect. For California, that means unemployment remaining around this 12% range, I think, through most of 2012, and staying in double digits through the end of 2014. We've actually downgraded this forecast since the last time I was down here a year ago a little bit. We've been stubbornly slow on the recovery here. And a lot of places where we've seen improvement in unemployment, it's due to people leaving the labor force. And not real growth in jobs. And so one of the reasons why I think the unemployment rate isn't going to be a good indicator over the next couple of years is we've got a lot of people who are going to come back into the labor force. And so even, and those people coming back in the labor force is actually good news. It's a sign of more optimism and the fact that they're looking for growth, but it'll also keep this unemployment rate at uncomfortably high levels. The current forecast is California will cover pre-recession number of jobs in 2016. So that would be 9 years of net zero job growth going back to 2007, a 9-year period where we added 3 million people to the state. In December, I've had opportunity to talk with some people in the state and the Department of Finance and stuff. I think this forecast doesn't look all that much different than theirs. I think, in fact, they may be more pessimistic. I'm 99% sure that we're probably going to see some mid-year budget cuts as a result of that. So be prepared. At least we know what what those are going to look like. And some of them are going to hit the university system, which is certainly important to Santa Cruz. Another thing that I'm going to talk about briefly, and this is my stump thing for policymakers looking forward, is typical California population growth is now 1% annually, and it has been for a decade or so, but there's still too many people in California who still think we're in the 3-4% population growth world, but we haven't been there in 20 years. And it's important to change our thinking about that, because if you keep thinking you're in a 3 and 4% population growth world, the lone economic growth world, it leads to you being optimistic and making some serious commitments that maybe you shouldn't. So in the long run picture, I think California needs to adapt to the fact that it's going to be a somewhat slower growing state in the future. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a maturing state as it's matured from a period of rapid immigration to slower growth. But with a slower growing and maturing state, there's some things that we have to pay attention to. Is A, watch your debt. Your base of taxpayers is not growing the way it used to be, and your debt levels are problematic, and you shouldn't add to those. Second, I know some people are saying that California needs to start thinking big. I think it needs to be thinking about the fact it's a 1% growth state and needs to reevaluate some expensive infrastructure expansion that people are still pushing in this state. And refocus towards reinvesting in existing infrastructure and education in your existing transportation system, which needs work and is ready to go today, not after 10 years of planning. So there's 3 areas I'll talk about with this. One is transportation. It just gets easier every month to whip on the high-speed rail project, and I've been beating on it for a few years now. And I'm something of an environmentalist, and I like the idea of, trains and high-speed rail. But I'm also someone who spends a lot of time out on Highway 99 and the roads in California. And, there's no excuse for some of the sorry state of some of our infrastructure. And that's really more important to our economic growth, which we need now, than some of these projects. So I like to see our focus, instead of $98 billion high-speed rail, to look at repairing, expanding the systems we have now and focusing on that regional transit that connects our super regions together, whether they're in LA or Northern California or others, and not so much this north-south expansion. I don't think we have a global economy now, and I don't think that this connection is valuable as some people think. The second one is an area where I've been studying a lot lately, and I'm somewhat in the minority on this view in California, but I think that 2 years from now I'll be in the majority, and that's water. And that instead of what they're talking about, another massive infrastructure project which won't yield a lot of new water, is they're talking about $15 to $20 billion or more in Delta water supply and environmental restoration plans, known interestingly as the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, although it is basically a $12 billion peripheral canal in tunnel form. It's outrageously expensive, generates very little new water, and it's just, the people who are promoting this thing can't figure out a financial plan for it. And the reason is there's big reasons to believe that the costs of this far exceed the benefits. There are more cost-effective solutions to this, including the actual levees. You can make them earthquake resistant for 10% of the cost of a peripheral canal. And we have important regional water supply projects that need to move forward. So similar to high-speed rail, we've got some big dream projects that engineers have up there that can't be financed. They're sort of unaffordable while we let the local systems deteriorate and ignore some of the simpler solutions that are there and that are available. So, and the third one isn't really an infrastructure one, but I'm happy to see the governor talking about pension reform. This absolutely is something that cannot wait. It's related to debt and realizing that we're in a 1% state now, not a 4% state, and that our base of people to pay these things is not growing the way it used to. These liabilities are killing local governments. I've absolutely been stunned at what I'm seeing, and particularly in some of the city and county budgets and how their pension and healthcare liabilities are killing their services that they provide to their people today. We need to move forward on this. So I'm happy to see the governor moving this conversation forward a little bit more aggressively than I anticipated. So let's talk a little bit about the Santa Cruz economy. I don't have a clock available. Hopefully I'm not running too over time here. No? All right. So just some observations. And again, I just come down to Santa Cruz to play every once in a while and talk to you guys, and I study a lot of data about it. And so most of these observations are data-based. Haven't seen anything that tells me otherwise so far. So when I look at this economy, I see a few things. One is it's slow growth, aging. I'm putting some question marks there because the data is interesting in this area and suggests that there may be some change here. Clearly an important linkage to San Jose and Silicon Valley. You're an area with high costs and low wages on your local jobs, on your job base, are really interesting. Government is the largest employer in terms of your concentration of employment is very heavy in state and local government. This includes education and UC. And your largest private industries, which are, I would say, are tourism and agriculture, are important industries, important drivers, but they generally have very seasonal jobs and are low paying, which is can be difficult in an area that has sort of high costs. This is a graph of Santa Cruz County population growth, and this has been updated since the new census results came out last time, since I came and saw you last time. And the population decline was actually a little bit less in Santa Cruz County than originally estimated. And it's an interesting pattern because we see, relatively steady growth in the 90s from 230,000 to in the mid-250s. And then we have a period of population decline through about 2006. And that somewhat mirrors what was seen in Silicon Valley and San Jose, a period of population decline. But what's interesting is that it's picked up since then. And it's picked up significantly. So Santa Cruz County, since 2006, has been growing population over 1% a year. So it's certainly an area that had slipped into a non-growth in population mode and has sort of been aging, but the data suggests that that's changed a little bit. Now, there's no doubt that some of that's related to the real estate market. 2006 probably was the last year that you could sell your expensive house in Santa Cruz and move somewhere else and live like a millionaire. And so that certainly, I'm sure, shut down the out-migration pattern somewhat from this region. But there's some other things too. Another indicator that's fun to look at are school enrollments, and this is an interesting one for Santa Cruz County. It mirrors the population trends where we had school enrollments declining for a while. Not huge changes from 40,706 to 238, losing about 2,000 students in your public schools over 6 years. Big deal if you're hiring teachers and planning the school budget. But it's sort of reversed a little bit, and recent school years have started to see enrollments come up a little bit as the population decline has turned around. And this is interesting because it's really different than the typical pattern we saw in California, which has been actually in recent years, what's a more typical California pattern has been enrollment declines the last couple of years after a period of growth through the 2000 to 2006 period. So you're very different here, you're special, not like the others. And here's one of the ways you're special, and which makes you a really difficult place to forecast, is the data. Well, first of all, small metro areas like Santa Cruz are always very difficult to forecast because the data is sort of less reliable and jumpy, and one project can move things a lot. But there's also some unique things about your economy. And I think it's best illustrated in personal income, because I don't know any place that has a personal income composition that looks like Santa Cruz's. $13 billion personal income, very similar to measured GDP in 2010. And here are some of the components of personal income. I talked about this a little bit last year, and it's changed a little bit since then. So I wanted to highlight some of those changes. $4.2 billion of that is local wages. It's an unusually low level in terms of total personal income from an area. Average private wage in Santa Cruz County is $751 a week. It's 26% less than the California average. If you just go back to before the recession in 2008, you're 22% lower than the California average on the wages paid on a private sector job in this region. Not talking about the public sector wages. So you've slid a little bit on that, 26% less than California. You're a little bit, in Stockton we're about $720 a week, so you're a little bit better than us, but you look a heck of a lot more like Stockton than you look like San Jose or the Bay Areas in terms of the wages on your private employment base. $3.1 billion investment in property income, almost as important as local paychecks coming from local sources. So that's a significant contributor here, and I think that's part of an aging population. And then probably the most thing that jumps out the most is $2.5 billion in wages earned in jobs that people have somewhere else and live here in Santa Cruz. And this is after you net out the people like, I forgot your name, and I met someone with the hospital that lives in San Jose and commutes here to Santa Cruz, and does it the opposite way. So even after you net out that, we're at $2.5 billion in net gain in wages that come in here from somewhere else. This is the highest of any county or MSA in the state, almost $10,000 in per capita that people are earning in wages somewhere else. And if you divide that by the roughly, by the net out commuters, you have a little bit more than 20,000 people a day commuting out to San Jose and a few other areas, and those coming in. But I don't have an exact number on this. I don't know that anybody does, but I ballpark that around $125,000 to $150,000 average wage for those people that work in San Jose and commute back here, which is extremely high, particularly relative to the local wages. So this is an important economic driver, the commuters out that bring money back here. And it's also unusual for a commuter area, because commuter areas typically are areas that are low-cost areas that people go to flee high-cost cities, and they tend to be, a lot of the commuters tend to be middle-class jobs, a lot of manufacturing, teachers, government workers, and those sorts of types. That's the story in Tracy and Fairfield and those sorts of areas. Here it's different. It seems to be a higher income worker that's locating here for lifestyle reasons and amenities. But anyway, when it comes to forecasting your economy, this makes it really difficult. And it also means that you have to pay close attention to what's going on in San Jose. Proprietors' income has declined, and then we have important reliance on government transfers. This has been a growing area of personal income, roughly 60-40 division between Social Security and retirement-related transfers and more on the public assistance side. Now, what's changed in this equation over the last 2 years? I guess the one thing I can point out is that if I look back at this personal income since 2008, we lost 175 million in local wages, but we've gained 50 million in these wages earned elsewhere. So that's continued to grow despite the recession impacts, but the local wage basis, you have not improved this imbalance at all. In fact, it's grown. We've seen declines in proprietors' incomes, and we've seen, like everywhere, significant increases in government transfer payments through the recession. And I just say, I probably shouldn't even put this as just from my own perspective. It's an unusual place to forecast because most local area forecasts are employment driven. And the reason it makes Santa Cruz a difficult area to forecast is that these local jobs are less important to your economy than they are in other areas. You're more driven by investment of proprietors' income and these wages that come elsewhere, particularly the wages from elsewhere and investment earnings and other things. So you don't necessarily learn a lot as much from the local wages. Here's a picture of home prices. If it makes you feel better, I could bring some for some other counties, and and you could look, and you might not feel so bad. But actually, a lot of this looks less different from others than you might expect. And there's no particular reason. I first made this this particular picture for the Stockton area in 2008, and everything came back and laid right on top of that red line. So I liked it, and I've continued it and repeated it for other areas. But basically, we've got a couple of home price indexes here. It's hard to find them for smaller counties like Santa Cruz, but there's a few things we can find. And I've set them all equal in the first quarter of 2000 to the median home price at the beginning of 2000, which was about $350,000 in Santa Cruz, according to the data that I've got. And then we've tracked all these indexes together. The Federal Housing Finance Authority Home Price Index. Zillow's got a home price index that works pretty good for cities and counties. It doesn't know the value of your house. We all know that. But as an index that tracks a market, it tracks other indicators pretty well. And it's available for small areas like this, so we can throw that up there. And the median home price is really volatile, and that's the orange line. And the red line's inflation. So that just sort of shows you, just as a thought experiment, what would happen if home prices grew along with the rate of inflation since 2000, and where would they be today? And the different home price index lines for this region don't completely agree, but they're all pretty close to that inflation-adjusted 2000 level. They've come back down there. Some places in California had the bigger bubbles are 15-20% below where that red line is. Other areas haven't quite come back to it yet, but it's not clear. If you look at a line like that, I guess the point here is if you're thinking that you're going to sell your house in Santa Cruz and move and live like a millionaire in Texas next year, you might have to wait a little bit longer. That home prices now in a lot of ways make way more sense than they have at any time in a decade in California. There are areas that are not named Santa Cruz in California that I think are underpriced in terms of real estate right now, where you can buy the median home and turn around and rent it and immediately clear a high rate of return. At $400,000 for the median home in Santa Cruz, I find that hard to believe that you could turn that much of a rate of return on it immediately, but I may be wrong. Housing starts. This is a painful picture for those of you in the building industry. If we go back to 1990, 500 seemed to be kind of the middle. A brief peak up to close to 1,000 a year earlier in the decade, and then falling off quite a bit to where you're lucky to have 100 these days. So this is not unusual. It's similar to most of California. We've seen some areas see 95% declines in housing starts through this downturn. The state as a whole went from about 200,000 to about 30,000. And it's starting to pick up on the multifamily side in the urban areas. That's picking up, but single-family home building in California is still declining, even in 2011, from record levels in record lows in 2010 and 2009. But the multifamily and the apartment projects in the large coastal cities seem to be on the upswing again, and we've got at least 2 years before we start to see single family start to pick up in some of the areas that aren't quite as hard hit. So something similar probably along here. Santa Cruz employment forecast. This is where, the current data in the small areas like this, you wonder a little bit sometimes about it, and you always wait for the revisions. But it actually shows, the data for 2011 shows a 3% gain in local jobs in Santa Cruz County. Really good, way above the state average. But Silicon Valley type of employment growth, and that's after 11% decline in 2007 to 2010. So the decline from 2007 to 2010 put Santa Cruz actually right up there in terms of job loss with some of the worst hit areas in the state. Somewhat surprising, actually, given the employment base. 11% job declines is the kind of things that hit Sacramento and Stockton and Modesto and those sorts of areas. But what has happened is a bit of a rebound in 2011. There's been a big increase in jobs in healthcare and some rebound in the hospitality sector, which is almost back up to pre-recession levels. And I think in 2011 we had a little bit of a pause in the UC cuts in last year's budget, but those have resumed in this year's budget. And so I think there was a slight respite, and we saw some pickup in healthcare and hospitality, which are important sectors around here. But actually, if you look at the bright spots in the California economy, tourism is one of them, and I think that that's important for Santa Cruz. Our forecast for 2012 and 2013 is for this to take a step back more to this 1% growth and job growth and not be outpacing the state anymore. Now, here's a bit of good news. In terms of scrounging around other data, the official unemployment rates for Santa Cruz County are 12 point something right now. It varies with the seasons. The official estimate for 2010 was 12.8%. It looks like it's going to come in at around 12.3 for 2011 once you even out the seasonal variations. And to be honest with you, I've been pretty surprised by that it went up to that level here. When I look at the employment base of the area, the connection to Silicon Valley, the large concentration of public employment, the hospitality sector, which is fair, and tourism sector, which has actually fared better than a lot of other sectors in California, and relatively low rates of home building leading into the recession. It was somewhat surprising to me to see this spike to this level. There's other surveys that are out there that lag a lot, and usually they track the official unemployment rates pretty well. But there's sometimes where you see statistically significant variations. And one that the Census Bureau does is called the American Community Survey. It actually has a larger sample than the EDD BLS. You just don't see the data until almost a year later after it's done. And the ACS data for 2009 and 2010 suggests, if you look backwards on it, that unemployment rate in this region is running about 2 percentage points below, more than 2, about 2.5 percentage points below what the sort of official statistics are. Really around 10% in 2010, not 12.8. It's one of the few areas in California where you see the discrepancy on the low side of that. There are some areas where it's on the high side, and they actually, almost every place where the census data is different than the EDD data, it sort of confirms my expectations. Like Sacramento, according to the Census Bureau, Sacramento County's got 15% unemployment, not 12. That sounds right to me, having spent a lot of time in Sacramento and looking at the data and the real implosion of the construction industry and the development industry. Most of the state, it's right dead on. And so So I guess on the silver lining things, there's part of me that suspects that actually it may not be quite as bad here as the headline unemployment rate that you read, whereas in a lot of places it may be the other way around. So the good news in the Santa Cruz economic story, some things that I think you're all familiar with. San Jose has got the fastest recovering economy arguably in the United States. It's a very strong recovery, and it has the potential to spill over here. San Jose, the job growth is not, GDP growth in San Jose has been 12% in 2010. It was out of 360 metro areas in the United States, San Jose was number 2 in 2010 GDP growth. It was number 1 for most of the year in wage growth. It just has a white-hot tech sector with high growth in wages and high growth in productivity. It hasn't necessarily spilled over to the broader economy yet. They have 2-3% job growth with 12% GDP growth. They're seeing localized shortage. They can't find enough software engineers. But overall, it's recovering very well, and that certainly bodes well for this region because of the linkages we've discussed. Also, I've discussed that tourism is one of the sectors that's doing well. I don't know if I have this in the bullet point, but I should also mention that agriculture is one of the sectors that's doing well in California. It's also a significant sector here in the Central Coast. So when you look at some of the industries that are important in this area, the San Jose spillover, the hospitality sector, agriculture, and export growth, things, it's not a bad mix to be in, with the exception of the concentration in state and local government. It's your downside. So your bad news is these UC budget cuts, and you're in an area where the government is the largest employer in terms of local jobs, and we know the governments are under a lot of pressure, and so we shouldn't expect a lot of job growth in the near future in this area. Long run issues pointed out is you need those San Jose spillovers to be businesses in Santa Cruz and not just commuters in Santa Cruz. It's certainly somewhat surprising. You've got a UC and you've got San Jose next door, and it's somewhat surprising that there aren't more higher paying private sector jobs in this region than there are. So that's a long run issue that the region needs to work on. Another one, this is a big national issue, not quite as big in California, but around here, when I look at the demographics, I've mentioned this to some folks in the Business Council before, and I'm just really curious of what the behavior of the boomers are going to be here, because there's a large demographic cohort in the 45 to 65 age group in the Santa Cruz area. It looks like some of those folks were the ones selling those homes in 2000 to 2006. And the question is, what are these folks going to do? I don't know, but I think it's going to be an issue for here over the next decade. Are they going to retire here and live here for the rest of their lives, or if the real estate market picks up, are they going to be looking to get out? What is going to be the role of this group of people nearing retirement age in the region? That's the end of my prepared remarks.
Thank you, Jeff, for a great presentation. We'll have his slides available on the website pretty soon. And again, thank you to Community Television. We'll have the link to the broadcast. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next year. We would love your input and feedback about other programs for 2012. See you again.